great introduction. One thing I've learned in this church is some of the worst things you can do when you call on a make presentation is to follow either small children in their singing, or an animal act, or our choir. I will always come off second best on that. Josiah, the king of Judah, assumed that throne when he was all of 8 years old. He ruled for 31 years, and in the course of that time compiled, or at least enabled, the compilation of Hebrew scriptures, which were and are the basis for the book of Deuteronomy. Today, from the second book of Kings, we get the history of Josiah's contribution to the Old Testament. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary, to the house of the Lord, saying, "Go up to the high priest Hilkiah, and have him count the entire sum of the money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people." That's all one sentence. "Let it be given into the hands of the workers who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Let them give it to the workers who are at the house of the Lord, repairing the house. That is, to the carpenters, to the builders, to the masons, and let them use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the house. But no account shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into their hand, for they deal honestly." The high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." When Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. And Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, "Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and delivered it into the hands of the workers who have oversight of the house of the Lord." Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "The priest Hilkiah has given me a book." Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. "Go, inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that have been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. Go, inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us." And later in 2 Kings, "Then the king directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him went all the people of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book." All the people joined in that covenant.
You know Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid and Donner and Blitzen. But do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? Storytelling. Storytelling is the oldest way for the people to connect as a community. Reciting stories builds the cohesion of a community through the shared experience, lessons, and memories of stories. And in your own family, you have someone, an older relative usually, who is the family sage, the wise person, who holds in their heart and their mind the family history and the stories. Go ask Uncle Bob about what Grandpa did in the big war. Did you know that our great-great-great-grandparents came here in a covered wagon or emigrated here from their homeland? Even in this church, we recite stories to remember who we are and how we got to this place we are in this journey of life. We retell these stories to pass on the oral knowledge to those who have recently joined us and to the young among us to build community and continuity of community. We've heard the stories of Harvey Clark and Tabitha Brown and A.T. Smith, and we have the good fortune to have a written history of this church, which tells us the many stories of the people who founded this congregation in this city. But as the Christmas song asks, the question it asks, do we recall the important stories? In the reading from Kings this morning, we find ourselves in need to put in context why it was important that the people had found the books of Moses. After the reign of Solomon, Israel split into two kingdoms, northern and southern. And this is the time of Elijah and Elisha, who are warning the people that they were in violation of their covenant with God. And the three things that the people were failing to honor: worship God alone. There were multiple gods and altars to all these gods. Thou shalt have no idol. The kings of the north and southern kingdoms were marrying for politics and embracing the foreign gods and statues of their wives. Faithfulness to the covenant, injustice, corruption, political assassinations, coups. These stories are riveting to read. For more information, please see me in the 5th to 7th grade learning community room, where we will be talking about this later in the fall. Woo! Yeah, right on. When Hilkiah, I think it's Hilkiah, but I like the way you said it, but I don't know if I can repeat it, finds the books of Moses, King Josiah calls the people of Judea together to hear a full reading of the books. And this was an attempt to reestablish the covenant with the people and with God. And he does this with an oral recitation of their history, a verbal retelling of who they are and how they got into this place that they find themselves. He reads to them their story. And much like Hilkiah, I too found my copy of our history book, and I found some very interesting stories about the founders of this church. Stories that retell how much they did not get along. The differences of opinion which challenged them as a community and church. It's a fascinating story of who and why, and it mostly revolved around perception of work, authority, and the prestige of who gets the credit. You know, what actually struck me is how the story of our finding fits neatly into the stories that we read in the Jewish Bible. It kind of gets squished somewhere between Judges and Kings. I really thought that would get a laugh. Okay. Thank you for the charity. I want to hold out for your listening, though, the part of the story that we do not actually dwell on, but we reference. And that's the founding of Tualatin Academy, which today we know as Pacific University. It all started with Tabitha Brown, a woman in her late 60s a widowed woman who came to the Oregon frontier after her husband had died, and she wanted to care for the orphans of the immigrants of the Applegate Trail. People traveling across this great country in covered wagons, across deserts and mountains, fording swift and mighty rivers, and they died attempting to get to a new life. And they left behind their children to whoever was there. Tabitha and Harvey found space in a log cabin, and they found themselves with 30 children. And thus, Tualatin Academy was born. The tribes of Israel wandered in a desert, and they too founded towns and cities and proceeded to need to take care of one another and the strangers that came to visit. And they too could not be content. And they relied on the judges to settle the disputes that arose. And squabbling and infighting for power, position, and prestige is a constant theme in the Jewish Bible. And it's compounded by the kings who did not listen to the prophets and were killing off their political enemies and hoarding enormous wealth. You have some of this same infighting between all the missionary preachers attempting to settle here in this area of the West Tualatin Plains. The academy building was built rival to Harvey Clark when J.S. Griffith sought to destroy Clark and take the academy into his own control. Griffith so desired the downfall of Harvey Clark that he offered the academy and Pacific University 720 acres and $3,950 if they would move the school from Forest Grove to Hillsboro. In today's dollars, that would be about $132,000. The trustees of the Academy and Pacific University were sorely tempted. Yet, the trustees raised $10,000 in cash and land, and they stayed where we find them today, across the street. And that works out to be about $335,000 in today's money. Enter in the Reverend Thomas Condon, who we know from the fossil beds in Condon, Oregon. He, like many other after him, attempted to settle these rifts of disagreement between the leadership of the churches and the schools and the community. And each time a laurel branch was extended from one faction, it would be refused or crushed by a new set of complaints and issues by the others in the argument. One of the founders of this church that fought for the reconciliation and future of both this church and the university was Mary and the Reverend Elkanah Walker. You might remember them if you turn around and look up at the stained glass windows, specifically the sower. It's okay if you turn around, I won't be offended. These windows have been on this church grounds in the many church buildings that occupied this ground since 1920. They were a gift from the elderly sons of the Walkers, and the Walkers were central to the land deal that left Pacific University across the street. Now, Pacific University and the Tualatin Academy were two separate entities when they were created, and the territorial legislature awarded the charter in 1849, at 4 years after the founding of this congregation and this church. And the academy closed their doors after graduating their last class in 1915. The school became Pacific University in 1854, and their first graduating class had one student. Blake, do you know who it is?
Harvey W. Scott.
Harvey W. Scott. And the first president of the school was the Reverend Sidney Marsh from this congregation. The relationship between the church and the school ebbed and flowed depending on the attitudes of the day and the men, and they were all men after Tabitha, of who was in charge. Funny, it is like the story in the Bible of how the Israelites were in covenant with God or not over the many years as told to us in the stories that we do find in Judges and Kings. Don't you think? We must look to the end of the last century when attempts to reconcile the differences between the church and the university took real root. And we have been blessed to have some very exceptional good pastors who saw the value of the relationship and worked to bring about a closer connection. And it all starts with the Reverend Clarence McCall. For your reference, all their pictures are in the hallway over there. We again experienced some ebb and flow in the thoughts and directions of the pastors called after McCall. However, Pastor Jack Kelly picked up the baton and, using the professors from the university, began discussion groups in the church. Kelly is the one who led our church to explore the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Kelly is attributed to strengthening the relationship in the church with Pacific, and in 1970 he left for the University of Oregon. And the work of Kelly was set, and it was continued and carried forward by the following pastors of this church: Rich Osborne, Richard Kroll, Jennifer Yoakum, and now Pastor Brendan Curran. Pastor Brendan, on the shoulders of those who came before, is working to forge a stronger connection with Pacific University. He has secured a position as the chaplain for the university. Brendan will explore many discussion groups on campus, and he has secured acceptance from the university that calls from this congregation will take priority over his many other duties. Brendan's undergraduate studies were in Native American cultures, and he continues to be in conversation with all parties on healing our history with the Indian Industrial Training and Boarding School, which operated in this town from 1880 to 1885. It would be somewhere between 22nd and 23rd C and D Streets. In 1885, the school moved to Salem and became the Chippewa Indian School, and the Indian School was administered by the Pacific University. But that's another story. Pamela, Jean, and I have seen a bit of this wonderful planet, and one of those locations was Iceland. There is a national park called Thingvellir, and it sits in the Rift Valley that marks the crest of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. That's the boundary between the North American Tectonic Plate and the Eurasian Tectonic Plate. And between 930 of the Common Era to 1798, all the people of Iceland met there every summer. They came to that site in the valley to hear the oral recitation of their laws. It was expected that the law speaker would recite it all from memory. And this helped the people to remember how they were to relate to each other, to live in a civilized and respectful manner. And they took this time to reconnect with kin and clan, to share the stories of what they saw and what they experienced over the last year or years. Just like King Josiah, reading the law of Moses in our scripture, telling stories to remember who we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Our holidays today are so commercialized, all in an effort to entice us to spend more money and our time away from what is important, which is our families and friends. Sharing a meal, sharing a story of trial and deliverance, The stories that we share today are living stories with meaning and purpose. There are stories. So sit right back, and I'm going to tell you a tale of a fateful trip. But actually, that's a different story for a different day. Amen.